is Global News and Zoom on Nigeria, bringing you today's top stories and insights. The headline says South Korea stops boat with North Korea defectors. U.S. pilot charged with attempted murder. China's foreign minister to pay rare visit to the United States. China's one calls for peace in Israel-Gaza war, and Israel pledges ruthless strikes, dozens killed in Gaza. South Korea's military said a group of North Koreans had defected to South Korea by crossing the sea border in a small wooden boat. On Tuesday, the boat was intercepted by South Korean authorities close to Sokcho, a city about 51 kilometers 32 miles northeast of Seoul, after being seen near the country's maritime border, the Joint Chiefs of Staff said. 4 North Korean occupants stated their wish to defect to South Korea, report said, citing unnamed government officials. Over 33,000 North Koreans have fled their repressive homeland for the liberal democratic South, where they are allowed to citizenship and financial support after being scrutinized by the intelligence services. Rivals in the South have dropped broadly since the COVID-19 pandemic, when Pyongyang increased border controls. Defections by sea are sporadic, with most defectors fleeing the north through the porous border with China, where they face the risk of arrest and deportation. Earlier this month, Seoul's Unification Ministry said it had raised its concerns with China after Chinese authorities repatriated a large number of North Koreans living in the northeastern provinces of Jilin and Liaoning. Beijing, which regards North Korean defectors as economic migrants, said there was no such thing as so-called North Korean defectors in China. 9 North Koreans defected after crossing the Western Sea boundary in a fishing boat in May. In 2019, South Korea's ex-president Moon Jae-in drew criticism from rights groups after his administration repatriated 2 North Korean fishermen suspected of murdering 16 shipmates while crossing the sea border. In February, a South Korean court indicted 4 top officials, including Moon's head of national intelligence, for allegedly abusing their authority in relation to the repatriations. Now, the United States, an off-duty pilot in the U.S. has been charged with 83 counts of attempted murder after allegedly trying to turn off a commercial plane's engines in mid-flight. The pilot, who was occupying the cockpit jump seat, tried to disable the aircraft's engines during a Horizon Airlines flight from Everett, Washington to San Francisco, California, before he was subdued by the flight crew, officials said on Monday. According to the local prosecutor's office, Joseph David Morrison, 44, was detained after the plane landed safely in Portland, Oregon on Sunday. He faces 83 counts of attempted murder, 83 counts of recklessly endangering another person, and 1 count of endangering an aircraft. The FBI in Portland said there was no continuing threat linked to this incident. The Federal Aviation Administration told U.S. Airlines in a notice that a validated jump seat passenger had sought to disable the engines of the twin-jet Embraer 175 by trying to activate the engine fire suppression system. One of the plane's pilots told an air traffic controller that the crew had got the guy that tried to shut the engines down out of the cockpit, and he doesn't sound like he's causing issues in the back right now, according to an audio recording. On Monday, Seattle-based Alaska Airlines, which owns Horizon, confirmed that one of its pilots had been involved in the incident, but said the captain and co-pilot quickly responded. Engine power was not lost and the crew secured the aircraft without incident. Airlines used the cockpit jump seat to accommodate pilots preparing to fly a later flight to avoid bombing a passenger off the plane. U.S. carriers also often let pilots from other airlines occupy the third seat. A Horizon Air ground agent in 2018 crashed a plane into a small island in Puget Sound after stealing an empty aircraft at Seattle SeaTac International Airport. The man told an air traffic controller that he wasn't really planning on landing and described himself as a broken guy. Wang Yi, Chinese foreign minister, will travel to the United States later this week as part of an ongoing attempt to restore the two countries' strained relations amid rising geopolitical crunch. Officials said the minister will visit Washington from October 26th to 28th and meet U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and President Joe Biden's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan after Blinken and other top officials went to Beijing in June. The U.S. intends to ensure disagreements between Washington and Beijing do not turn into conflict and that they can work together on issues of mutual concern. Other U.S. politicians have traveled to China since Blinken's visit, with California Governor Gavin Newsom currently in the country to discuss climate change. We continue to believe that direct face-to-face diplomacy is the best way to raise challenging issues, address misperception and miscommunication, and explore working with the Chinese where our interests intersect, one official who said according to reports on condition of anonymity. The meetings are expected to cover a range of issues, including the Israel-Hamas conflict, the Ukraine war, and the growing tension in the South China Sea. Senior administration officials who spoke on condition of anonymity said according to reports. Washington is sending military support to Israel and Ukraine, while Beijing has grown closer to Russia since the Ukraine war erupted in February 2022 and has called for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. A second official said the U.S. will push the Chinese to take a more constructive approach on both. On Monday, Wang held talks via phone with the foreign ministers of Israel and the Palestinian Authority and expressed sadness at the civilians suffering as a result of the conflict. He reiterated China's calls for a ceasefire and backing for a two-state solution. Washington has placed significance on China's ability to influence Iran. During his whirlwind trip last week to the Middle East, Blinken held a phone call with Wang, asking him to use Beijing's influence in the region to make sure the conflict does not widen. On Israel-Palestine conflict, China's foreign minister again Wang Yi has told his Israeli counterpart that Beijing was deeply saddened by the large number of civilian losses in the intensifying Israel-Hamas war and urged measures to stop a further escalation in violence and establish a lasting peace. The conflict, which erupted on October 7th, represented a major choice between war and peace, Wang told Eli Cohen in a phone conversation, report said on Tuesday. The Chinese foreign minister, who is due to visit the United States later this week, acknowledged that every country had a right to self-defense, but they should abide by international humanitarian law and defend the safety of civilians. China has condemned the conflict that began after the Hamas armed group launched a surprise attack on Israel that killed at least 1,400 people. The Israeli government responded with a declaration of war on the Hamas-controlled enclave of Gaza, cutting off its supplies of food, water, and power, and subjecting the densely populated territory to relentless bombardment. About 2.3 million people live in Gaza, and more than 5,000 people have been killed in the past 2 weeks. Wang told Cohen that China was deeply concerned about the continuous increase of the conflict and the deteriorating situation, and deeply saddened by the huge number of civilian casualties caused by the conflict, according to reports. China has sought to position itself as a peacemaker in the conflict, and its special envoy to the Middle East, Zaya Jun, is presently on a tour of the region. On Monday, Zaya said Beijing was willing to do whatever is conducive to promote dialogue, secure a ceasefire, and restore peace. The envoy is set to travel to the United Arab Emirates on Tuesday and will remain in the region in the coming days, according to the Foreign Ministry. Wang also spoke on the phone with Palestinian Foreign Minister Riyad al-Maliki, voicing his fears and sympathy for the great number of civilians killed in Gaza and the crucial need to stop the war. Al-Maliki is part of the Palestinian Authority that is separate from Hamas. The Chinese foreign minister condemned the Israeli attacks on hospitals and schools, which aim civilians and violate international law, and emphasized the need to stop the mass killing and the displacement policy, according to reports. Still sticking with Israel-Palestine conflict, Israel has sworn unrelenting attacks to eliminate Hamas as Palestinian authorities reported loads of people killed in the newest airstrikes in Gaza. No fewer than 28 people were killed overnight in strikes on numerous homes in a district near Rafah, southern Gaza, Palestinian officials and medical sources said, according to report in Gaza. At least 14 others were also killed after an explosion at a fuel station following an Israeli strike in Khan Yunis, in the south of the enclave, Palestinian authorities said. There were conflicting reports about the death figure, with Palestinian media reporting that more than 50 people have been killed in the strikes. Gaza's health ministry said dozens of people were also killed or injured in Israeli strikes on the Al-Shati refugee camp in northern Gaza. Israel's military said it had aimed a Hamas staging ground in the refugee camp without providing further details. The newest strikes come after Gaza's health ministry said on Monday that Israel's bombardment of the enclave had killed over 430 people during the earlier 24 hours, taking the total death toll in the enclave to over 5,000 people. Israel has bombarded Gaza and enforced a near-total blockade for more than 2 weeks as it seeks to eliminate Hamas in response to the armed group's October 7th attacks inside the country, with Israeli officials say killed over 1,400 people, mostly civilians. On Tuesday, Israeli Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi signaled that Israel will not let up on its bombardment ahead of an expected ground invasion of the densely populated enclave. Israeli forces also hurled a new round of night raids in the occupied West Bank overnight, with heavily armed troops backed by armored vehicles seen in at least 2 areas of the Palestinian territory. Israel's intensifying attacks come as the country faces growing calls for restraint amidst warnings of a humanitarian catastrophe in the besieged enclave. Former United States President Barack Obama, in a rare intervention on Monday, said Israel's actions in Gaza could erode global trust in the country and harden Palestinian attitudes for generations to come. Away from Israel-Gaza war, now to flood survivors in Pakistan fight climate anxiety. Pakistan last year experienced unprecedented floods. More than 33 million people were directly affected, with an overwhelming 20.6 million needing urgent humanitarian aid. The consequences were dire. Nearly 8 million people were displaced and at least 2 million houses damaged. A year later, the scars of the catastrophe remain fresh, although the water has receded. At least 1.5 million people are still displaced. Basic necessities such as food and shelter continue to be out of reach for a large portion of the flood-affected population, with over 40% of them relying on humanitarian aid for survival. While the abrupt concerns of food, shelter and water have been largely tackled, climate anxiety among the flood-affected communities across Pakistan has failed to make headlines. Although climate anxiety is a newly coined term, it reflects an agony that has long been felt by these communities. Amidst the rising threat of climate change, floods in Pakistan have grown more common, resulting in some communities facing an unending circle of displacement and gloom. For these communities, the fatigue caused by climate-induced disasters has started to take its toll. They are not only exhausted but also more anxious than ever about the potential threat of gushing disasters. Residents in these flood-affected areas are living in fear of an uncertain future. They battle with the harsh reality that they lack the essential preparations to face another flood, and they have no clear plans for shelter should their already fragile homes become inhabitable. Despite contributing very little to the global climate crisis, Pakistan remains one of the countries most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and climate anxiety will likely continue to rise in the country, especially among the most vulnerable populations. In Africa, 38 sentenced to death in Algeria. On Monday, 38 people were sentenced to death in Algeria for their role in the 2021 killing of Jamel Bensmil. He had been falsely accused of beginning deadly forest fires in the northeastern Kabylie region, when in fact he had volunteered to fight them. As the Defense Committee for the late Jamel Bensmil, we believe that the verdict is just. The court questioned the defendants sufficiently to ensure a fair and just verdict for all, said Fakir Eddin Barana, a member of Bensmil's Defense Committee. Bensmil had handed himself in after hearing he was suspected of arson at the height of the blazes, which killed at least 90 people. But a crowd encircled the police van, beating him before dragging him outside and setting him on fire, with some even taking selfies next to his body. His gruesome murder set off a wave of revulsion across the country after the images went viral, often shared with the hashtag Justice Paul Jamil Bensmil, the people who took the selfies tried to cover their tracks, but internet users across the country gathered videos and took screenshots to make sure the crime did not go unpunished. According to reports, out of the 94 defendants, 27 were acquitted and the remaining 29 who were not sentenced to death received jail terms ranging from 3 to 20 years. The fires were stimulated by a blistering heat wave, but the authorities also blame arsonists. The death sentence for the 38 will be commuted to life in prison as Algeria has a suspension on capital punishment. Stay tuned for a brief break. We'll be right back with more news shortly. You're welcome back. Let's continue with stories from Nigeria. The Apex Court adjourns PDP LP appeals on Tinubu's win. Justice John Okoro, the chairman of the Supreme Court panel hearing the appeals against the election of President Bola Tinubu on Monday, said the People's Democratic Party PDP standard bearer in the February presidential election, Atiku Abubakar, must prove the allegation of certificate forgery level against the ex-Lagos State Governor beyond reasonable doubt. Okoro handed down the admonition during the hearing of the election petition appeals filed by Atiku and Peter Obi of the Labour Party. He stated this following the submission of Atiku's lead counsel, Chris Uche's son, urging the courts to admit the new evidence brought by the petitioners. Atiku had prayed to an Illinois Chicago District Court to order the Chicago State University CSU to release the president's academic records in his bid to nullify Tinubu's victory and prove the allegation that he was not qualified to contest the presidential election. The former vice president had accused Tinubu of falsifying the CSU diploma of Bachelor of Science in Business Administration awarded in 1979 that he submitted to the Independent National Electoral Commission. He demanded a copy of any diploma issued by CSU in 1979, a copy of the diploma the CSU gave to Tinubu in 1979, and copies of diplomas with the same font, seal, signatures, and wording awarded to all the students that are alike to what CSU awarded to him in 1979. Atiku's application was opposed by Tinubu's lawyers, citing privacy concerns, even as they approved that only the certificate should be released and not other privileged records. But the United States court ordered the release of the ex-Lagos State Governor's academic records, which Atiku filed in support of his election petition appeal at the Supreme Court. Uche claimed that the issue of Tinubu's academic records was a weighty matter and urged the Supreme Court to admit it as fresh evidence while addressing the Apex Court on Monday. Atiku's lead counsel also said the issue of 180 days should not tie the hands of the court, but Justice Okoro, while describing the matter as criminal in nature, said it must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. He observed that there were two conflicting letters from Chicago State University. According to him, one of the letters authenticated the president's certificate and other discredited him, according to them. Justice Emmanuel Egan, another panel member, observed that the testimony Atiku was seeking to tender as evidence was done in the chambers of Atiku's lawyer and not in the courtroom. Tinubu praises Nigeria's P&ID case win. On Monday, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu celebrated the judgment rendered by Judge Robin Knowles of the Business and Property Court in London. The court awarded a landmark victory to the federal government of Nigeria over a firm known as Process and Industry Development P&ID Limited, according to report. Tinubu made the commendation in a statement by his special advisor, media and publicity chief, Ajuri Ngalale. He said the judgment proved overwhelmingly that nation-states will no longer be held hostage by economic conspiracies between private firms and solitarily corrupt officials. Ngalale said, and I quote, following Judge Knowles' dismissal of the $11.5 billion value of the award plus accumulated interest previously won by P&ID over a failed 2010 deal to allegedly build a gas processing plant on the grounds that the award was obtained by fraud, President Tinubu commends the UK court for prioritizing the merits of the case above all other considerations. This landmark judgment proves conclusively that nation-states will no longer be held hostage by economic conspiracy between private firms and solitarily corrupt officials who conspire to extort and indebt the very nations they swear to defend and protect. He said the victory was not for Nigeria alone, adding that it was a victory for the long exploited continent and for the developing world at large, which has for too long been on the receiving end of unjust economic malpractice and overt exploitation. Nigeria is appreciative of the tremendous efforts of the defense team and acknowledges the role of the Federal Ministry of Justice and Office of the Attorney General in the process of defending Nigeria's interests in this case, the president was quoted as saying, he said. And finally, on the news, federal government starts student loan payment January 2024. The federal government will begin the disbursement of student loan to Nigerians by January 2024, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has announced. Tinubu, who spoke at the opening session of the ongoing Nigeria Economic Summit in Abuja on Monday, said the program in his furtherance of his commitment to better the travails of Nigerians. You have my commitment that my government will act on all its promises, and the summit report, when it is received, be ready to challenge me after you have crafted those recommendations, he said. Students and parents are worried over the new hikes in tuition by some higher institutions amidst the delay in the implementation of a loan scheme anticipated to begin this month. The student loan scheme was initiated by President Tinubu's administration to provide interest-free education loans for Nigerians willing to get tertiary education. According to reports, most of the processes needed for implementation as stipulated by the law are not yet in place. The Access to Higher Education Act 2023, otherwise known as Students' Loan Act, with its enactment earlier in June, established an education loan fund to aid Nigerians fund their higher education while they pay in installments 2 years after finishing their participation in the National Youth Service Corps (NYSC) program. As of 2 months ago, reports show the implementing ministries and agencies are yet to put together modalities to ensure the smooth takeoff of the scheme as set by the law. It was also gathered that issues of funding, modalities and guidelines for disbursement of the loan to students were yet to be set and defined by the government. The proposed education bank that will facilitate disbursement as contained in the Act has not been established yet. To refresh our memory, South Korea stops boat with North Korea defectors. U.S. pilot charged with attempted murder. China's foreign minister to pay rare visit to the United States. China's Wang calls for peace in Israel-Gaza war, and Israel pledges ruthless strikes, dozens killed in Gaza. Thank you for joining us on Global News and Zuma Nigeria. That's all for today's news. Stay informed and have a great day.